She didn't raise her voice when things began to change between them, and that silence confused him. At first, the distance felt subtle, almost invisible, disguised as routine and emotional fatigue. She still showed up, still listened, still cared, but something inside her had quietly shifted. He noticed she stopped asking the same questions she once repeated with visible concern. What he didn't notice was how heavy those unanswered questions had become for her over time. Every ignored feeling stacked silently, forming a weight she carried without complaint or drama. She learned to swallow disappointment with grace, mistaking endurance for emotional maturity. From the outside, everything appeared stable, even comfortable, especially from his perspective. He interpreted her calm as acceptance, not realizing it was actually emotional withdrawal. That misunderstanding would later become the foundation of his most painful regret. She had once believed patience was proof of love, a sacrifice that strong relationships required. Each time she chose understanding over confrontation, she thought she was protecting something meaningful. He benefited from that belief without ever questioning the cost it demanded from her spirit. While she adjusted herself to keep the peace, he remained exactly where he was emotionally. There was no cruelty in his behavior, just neglect disguised as familiarity and emotional laziness. He assumed closeness was permanent, something that could not be lost through inaction. She tried to communicate softly, hoping subtle signals would be enough to reach him. But subtlety only works when someone is listening, and he had stopped doing that long ago. Over time, her words felt unnecessary, even exhausting, as if speaking no longer mattered. That was the moment silence stopped being temporary and became a decision. Inside her, something broke quietly, without tears, without anger, and without dramatic confrontation. She realized she was carrying the emotional responsibility for two people completely alone. The effort to hold the relationship together began to feel heavier than the relationship itself. She questioned whether love should require constant self-erasure to survive another ordinary day. Every compromise she made moved her further away from who she once was. Yet she smiled, functioned, and stayed composed, convincing even herself that she was fine. He never asked if she was still happy, because her calm gave him false reassurance. The absence of conflict became proof, in his mind, that everything was under control. What he couldn't see was that peace without connection is only quiet loneliness. And loneliness, when ignored long enough, eventually demands a decision. This was not the story of a sudden breakup or an impulsive emotional explosion. It was the slow erosion of presence, respect, and mutual effort over countless ordinary days. She didn't plan to leave, and she didn't threaten to walk away for attention. She simply reached a point where staying required betraying herself completely. He believed stability meant safety, unaware that stability without care becomes emotional neglect. From his view, nothing was wrong enough to justify fear or urgency. From hers, everything important had already been lost internally. She had not left yet, but she was already preparing herself emotionally to stand alone. This preparation was invisible, silent, and dangerously underestimated by him. And that underestimation would soon change everything he thought he controlled. She didn't announce her emotional withdrawal, and that made it easier for him to ignore. There were no ultimatums, no dramatic warnings, no visible breaking point he could recognize. Instead, she became quieter, more selective with her energy, more protective of her peace. He noticed she stopped seeking reassurance and stopped reacting to his emotional absence. What felt like relief to him was actually the beginning of irreversible distance. He interpreted her independence as strength, not realizing it was preparation for separation. Each day without conflict convinced him he still held the upper hand emotionally. He felt secure in the assumption that she would always be there when he needed her. That comfort slowly turned into entitlement, though he never named it as such. He didn't see that comfort was blinding him to reality. She began investing in herself in ways that didn't include him anymore. Her routines shifted, her focus sharpened, and her emotional availability narrowed. She stopped explaining her exhaustion because she no longer expected understanding. The conversations became polite instead of intimate, functional instead of connected. He noticed the change, but chose not to question it too deeply. Questioning it might have required effort, vulnerability, or accountability he wasn't ready to face. So he stayed silent, assuming time would naturally correct what felt slightly off. Meanwhile, she was mentally rehearsing a life that no longer revolved around him. That rehearsal wasn't fueled by anger, but by clarity and emotional self-respect. She wasn't running away. She was calmly realigning her life. The more composed she became, the more confident he felt in his position. Her lack of demands convinced him that he was no longer at risk of losing her. He believed relationships fail loudly, not quietly, and that misconception protected his ego. He never considered that emotional exhaustion looks peaceful right before departure. While she was learning how to let go, he was learning how to relax. That imbalance would soon reveal itself in ways he never anticipated. She no longer needed reassurance because she had already answered her hardest questions. Staying or leaving had stopped being a debate and became a matter of timing. Every day she stayed was not hope, but closure forming slowly. He mistook her grace for tolerance, and that mistake grew heavier by the hour. When she finally reached the point of emotional readiness, nothing dramatic happened. There was no argument to win, no final speech meant to shock him awake. She simply stopped fighting for something that no longer fought for her. In her mind, the relationship had already ended weeks before any physical departure. He still believed everything was under control because nothing had exploded yet. What he didn't understand was that endings don't always arrive with noise. Some endings arrive with calm certainty and irreversible emotional distance. She wasn't leaving to teach him a lesson or force a reaction. She was leaving because staying no longer aligned with who she had become. And that alignment made her silence more powerful than any confrontation ever could. The moment she finally left did not look dramatic from the outside, and that confused him deeply. There were no tears, no raised voices, no last-minute arguments meant to reopen old wounds. She packed her things with steady hands and a calm expression that unsettled him silently. He expected hesitation, uncertainty, or at least visible sadness to confirm his importance. Instead, she moved with quiet certainty, as if this decision had already been lived internally. That calm was not indifference, but the result of emotional closure, completed long before departure. He watched her walk away without fully understanding what had just been lost. In his mind, this was a pause, not an ending, something temporary and reversible. He assumed time would soften her resolve the way it always had before. What he didn't realize was that time had already worked against him. At first he felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with disbelief and misplaced confidence. The absence of tension made the space feel lighter, almost deceptively peaceful. He told himself she needed space, that distance would restore balance naturally. Friends reassured him that strong women always come back once emotions settle. That reassurance fed his ego and delayed any serious self-reflection. He continued his routines unchanged, convinced control had never truly left his hands. Messages were sent casually, without urgency, without accountability, without real vulnerability. He believed availability was permanent, something he could access whenever he chose. Each unanswered message felt temporary, not threatening, and certainly not final. He underestimated how quickly silence can become permanent. Days passed, then weeks, and the absence began to feel unfamiliar instead of comfortable. Small moments highlighted her absence in ways he hadn't anticipated. There was no one to absorb his emotional weight at the end of difficult days. No one adjusted their needs to accommodate his moods or emotional distance. He began to notice how much she had silently carried for him. That realization arrived slowly, accompanied by mild discomfort he tried to ignore. He still believed he had time, that reconciliation was simply a matter of timing. He postponed difficult conversations, trusting familiarity to do the work for him. What he failed to see was that familiarity had already expired, and expiration does not reverse once fully reached. The first signs of panic did not arrive as fear, but as confusion. He noticed she no longer responded the way she once had. Her replies were polite, distant, and emotionally closed, lacking any invitation. She didn't argue, didn't question, didn't attempt to reconnect emotionally. That emotional wall unsettled him more than anger ever could have. He felt the ground shift beneath the assumptions he had relied on for years. Control, once taken for granted, now felt unstable and unreliable. For the first time, he sensed that her departure was not a tactic. It was a conclusion he had been excluded from until it was complete. And that realization marked the beginning of his emotional free fall. The panic did not announce itself immediately because pride delayed his understanding of loss. He told himself her distance was strategic, a temporary stance meant to regain leverage. That belief allowed him to stay passive longer than he should have. He avoided asking direct questions, fearing answers he wasn't ready to face yet. Instead of confronting reality, he waited for familiarity to rescue him again. But familiarity no longer worked, and silence refused to soften this time. Each unanswered message chipped away at the confidence he once carried effortlessly. The certainty that she would return began to weaken with every quiet day. What once felt controlled now felt fragile and unpredictable. And unpredictability made him deeply uncomfortable. He started replaying moments he once dismissed as insignificant. Small conversations, subtle requests, emotional cues he had ignored resurfaced relentlessly. He recognized patterns too late, realizing she had been asking for presence, not perfection. Those memories did not bring clarity, only guilt mixed with delayed awareness. He attempted casual check-ins, hoping lightness would reopen emotional access. Her responses remained respectful but firm, offering no emotional entry point. She did not explain herself because she no longer needed to be understood. That lack of explanation unsettled him more than confrontation ever would have. For the first time, he felt excluded from her inner world completely. And exclusion was something he had never learned to tolerate. As his confidence eroded, urgency replaced comfort, and anxiety replaced control. He reached out more often, his tone shifting from casual to concerned. He began offering changes, adjustments, and promises he once believed unnecessary. But those promises arrived after the emotional window had already closed. She did not argue against them or demand proof. She simply acknowledged them without reopening the door he hoped to walk through. Her calm response made his desperation more visible to himself. He realized she wasn't negotiating or testing him anymore. She had already chosen peace over possibility, and that choice left no room for persuasion. By the time panic fully settled in, he understood something irreversible had happened. The power dynamic he once relied on had collapsed quietly but completely. He was no longer deciding the pace, the terms, or the outcome. For the first time, he was reacting instead of leading emotionally. He felt the unfamiliar weight of consequences delayed too long. Her absence was no longer a pause, but a permanent shift in reality. He recognized that control lost late cannot be reclaimed with urgency alone. This was not a misunderstanding or a phase that time would correct. It was the direct result of choices postponed and needs minimized repeatedly. And in that realization, his emotional fall reached its lowest point. While his world felt like it was shrinking, hers was quietly expanding in unfamiliar ways. She did not feel relief immediately, but she felt alignment for the first time in years. Waking up without emotional tension gave her clarity she hadn't realized she was missing. There was sadness, yes, but it was clean, not mixed with constant self-betrayal. She noticed how much energy she had spent managing someone else's emotional comfort. Without that responsibility, her thoughts became calmer and more focused. She began listening to herself again instead of negotiating her needs internally. That internal stillness felt unfamiliar, but deeply grounding at the same time. For the first time, her peace did not depend on being understood by him. It depended only on being honest with herself. She reflected on the relationship without anger, just clear-eyed accountability and acceptance. She saw where she had stayed too long and where she had explained herself excessively. There was no desire to rewrite the past or demand acknowledgement from him. Understanding came not as regret, but as a lesson integrated quietly into her identity. She recognized that love without reciprocity slowly erodes self-respect. That realization did not harden her, it strengthened her boundaries instead. She stopped romanticizing potential and began valuing consistent presence. What once felt like sacrifice now felt like unnecessary self-abandonment. This shift did not make her colder, it made her more selective. And selectivity restored her sense of personal authority. Meanwhile, his attempts to reconnect intensified as her emotional availability decreased. He sensed the imbalance growing, but misunderstood its origin completely. He believed effort alone could repair what neglect had already dismantled. What he didn't grasp was that effort matters only when it arrives on time. Each message he sent felt heavier, more exposed, more urgent than the last. Her responses remained kind but distant, offering no emotional leverage. That contrast forced him to confront an unfamiliar truth about himself. He was now the one seeking reassurance, stability, and emotional access. The roles had shifted permanently, and he felt unprepared for that reversal. That discomfort marked the beginning of his own reluctant self-examination. She did not announce her growth or frame it as strength for anyone else. There were no declarations, no need to prove she was doing better without him. Her transformation was internal, measured by how little she needed external validation. She chose routines, environments, and conversations that respected her emotional limits. Slowly, confidence returned, not loud, not performative, but grounded and consistent. She wasn't trying to become someone new. She was reclaiming who she had always been. This reclamation changed how she moved, spoke, and held herself in silence. That quiet confidence was not directed at him, yet he felt it immediately. He realized she was no longer reacting to his presence or absence, and that realization unsettled him more than losing her ever had. Her days no longer revolved around anticipation, anxiety, or emotional monitoring of someone else's behavior. She noticed how differently time moved when she wasn't waiting for messages or emotional cues. Mornings felt lighter, evenings quieter, and decisions simpler without constant self-negotiation. She began trusting her instincts again, something she had muted to maintain harmony before. That trust guided her toward choices that felt steady instead of emotionally exhausting. She surrounded herself with people and environments that respected her boundaries naturally. There was no urgency to explain her growth or justify her distance to anyone. Her silence was no longer defensive. It was intentional and self-protective. Each day reinforced the same truth she had once been afraid to face. Peace does not require permission from those who benefit from your exhaustion. She became aware of how differently she carried herself now, both physically and emotionally. There was no stiffness, no guarded posture, just a grounded presence rooted in self-respect. Conversations felt more honest because she no longer feared losing herself in them. She could listen without absorbing, care without overextending, and walk away without guilt. That balance had once seemed impossible within the relationship she left behind. Now it felt natural, even obvious, as if she had simply returned to herself. She did not feel superior, just clearer about what she would no longer tolerate. This clarity was quiet but firm, leaving no room for negotiation or confusion. Her standards were no longer reactions to pain, but reflections of self-knowledge. And self-knowledge made her unshakable in ways he could sense but not reach. From his perspective, her transformation felt abrupt, almost unfair in its timing. He struggled to reconcile her calm distance with the urgency he now carried daily. The more composed she became, the more exposed his emotional instability felt to him. He attempted vulnerability, hoping transparency would reopen a connection he had taken for granted. But vulnerability without consistency arrived hollow, stripped of the trust it required. She acknowledged his words without reopening emotional space for further negotiation. That response forced him to confront the depth of what he had lost. Not just her presence, but the version of himself she once softened unknowingly. He realized how much of his emotional comfort had depended on her tolerance, and that tolerance was no longer available to him. She did not celebrate this shift or frame it as empowerment for display. There was no performance, no announcement, no desire to be witnessed in her growth. Her transformation expressed itself through calm decisions and consistent self-alignment. She chose rest over explanation, boundaries over arguments, and peace over persuasion. That choice required discipline, not strength, and she practiced it daily. Each time she upheld her boundaries, her confidence deepened further. She wasn't trying to teach him a lesson or provoke regret. She was simply honoring the life she had rebuilt internally. That honor gave her an authority that no reaction from him could disrupt. And with that authority fully integrated, her transformation reached completion. By the time he fully understood what he had lost, she was no longer emotionally reachable. There was no anger left to negotiate with, no sadness to soften her resolve. Her calm was no longer a phase, but a settled state she protected deliberately. He realized too late that access to her had once been a privilege, not a guarantee. The panic he felt came from recognizing how permanent that loss had become. He reached out with urgency now, not confidence, and that difference was impossible to hide. Every message carried weight, expectation, and unspoken fear of final rejection. She read them without resentment, but also without invitation or emotional engagement. What once would have pulled her back now simply passed through her unchanged. That emotional immunity marked the true shift in power. He attempted explanations that sounded reasonable, but arrived stripped of credibility. Promises were made with intensity, yet lacked the foundation of consistent action. He spoke about change as if it were immediate, forgetting how long neglect had lasted. What he didn't understand was that she no longer needed reassurance to move forward. She had already built stability within herself, independent of his intentions. Listening to him did not reopen wounds, but it also did not reopen doors. Her responses remained composed, respectful, and emotionally final. There was nothing left to argue about, because the decision had already been lived through. That quiet finality unsettled him more than confrontation ever could have. He was no longer part of her emotional equation. For the first time, he experienced the consequences of delay without the option to undo them. He recognized that attention given late does not restore trust lost gradually. The urgency he now carried highlighted the comfort he once misused. He saw clearly how often he had relied on her patience as emotional insurance. That insurance had expired the moment she chose herself without resentment. He stood face to face with the reality that effort cannot replace timing. No apology could compensate for presence withheld when it mattered most. This realization did not bring him closure, only clarity shaped by regret. He understood that panic is the cost of control mistaken for security, and that cost had finally come due. She did not respond to his panic with triumph or moral superiority. There was no satisfaction in watching him struggle with the consequences of his inaction. Her justice was not rooted in punishment, but in self-respect upheld consistently. She did not need him to understand in order to move forward fully. The balance had already been restored within her long before this moment. What he felt now was not her power over him, but his loss of access. She walked forward without bitterness, without urgency, and without looking back. The dignity in that movement spoke louder than any explanation ever could. He remained behind, forced to confront himself without her emotional shelter. And that separation marked the beginning of consequences he could no longer escape. Time continued moving forward, but it no longer carried the same meaning for either of them. For her, time became spacious, intentional, and free from emotional tension she once normalized. She no longer measured days by reactions, responses, or emotional availability from someone else. Her life expanded quietly into places that required presence instead of endurance. She trusted herself now, not because she had hardened, but because she had clarified her values. Every decision reflected alignment rather than fear of loss or abandonment. She did not miss him the way she once feared she would. What she missed was a version of herself she had already fully reclaimed. That reclamation gave her a sense of completion that required no external validation. And with that completion came peace that could not be negotiated away. He, on the other hand, carried awareness that arrived without relief or resolution. Understanding did not soften the weight of consequence. It sharpened it instead. He saw clearly where he had chosen comfort over connection and certainty over care. There was no one left to absorb the emotional weight of that realization. Growth, when forced by loss, feels heavier than growth chosen willingly. He attempted to rebuild himself without the emotional safety net he once relied on. That process was slow, uncomfortable, and stripped of illusion. For the first time, he had to sit fully with the results of his choices. No explanation could undo what had already been lived through by her. And that truth followed him longer than he expected. She did not speak about the ending as a lesson or a victory. There was no narrative she needed to control or justify publicly. Her life spoke for itself through consistency, calm, and self-respect. Those who met her afterward noticed a grounded confidence that required no explanation. She did not walk faster, louder, or more defiantly than before. She simply walked forward without carrying emotional weight that wasn't hers. That quiet authority was not directed at him, yet it defined the ending clearly. She had not won against him. She had won herself back. And that distinction mattered more than any reconciliation ever could have. It was the kind of justice that does not announce itself. The story did not end with reconciliation, revenge, or dramatic confrontation. It ended with alignment restored on one side and awareness forced on the other. Both lives continued, but no longer intersected emotionally or psychologically. She moved forward whole, not healed by time, but healed by choice. He moved forward altered, shaped by understanding that arrived too late to change outcomes. There was no villain crowned and no hero declared publicly. Only consequences distributed exactly where they belonged. She walked away like a queen, not because she was admired, but because she refused to abandon herself any longer, and that refusal became the final, undeniable form of justice.